Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. For this bonus episode of the podcast, I've had the chance to talk with Jacob Bloomfield, author of the recently published book Drag, A British History. A little left field, you might think, but Jacob's research gives us a fascinating insight into the more recent history of this particular theatrical style, and, as you will hear, some broader social history and the story of the final demise of theatre censorship in the UK. I spoke to Jacob over Zoom and began by asking him to introduce himself.
My name is Jacob Bloomfield. I'm a Zukunftskolleg Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Konstanz here in southwest Germany, and I'm also an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Kent.
So it seemed to me that a new study of drag in theatre is really very timely because of things like RuPaul's Drag Race on the television, Mrs. Brown's Boys for anyone in the UK who might have seen that. And in fact, I've just been to see the 40th anniversary production of La Cage aux Folles in London this summer.
I heard that's out there, yeah. Very
yes,
cool.
It's a very good production. But of course, drag goes back a long way from that. We could take it right back to the Elizabethan prohibitions of women on stage. There's certainly a strong 17th century tradition. And then the Victorian Music Hall also has a tradition. I can remember seeing Charlie's Aunt myself in my younger years. And even Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest, being played by a man on several well-known occasions. But your book, although it does cover some of that older history, it really concentrates on the century from about the 1870s, when a lot of drag made that transition from the Victorian Music Hall into the theatre itself. And one of those characters, and one of the things I loved about the book was the performers who turn up in it as characters in themselves. And I thought maybe to give people a flavour of the book, we might talk about Arthur Lucan and his female persona, Old Mother Riley, because he really made the crossover from the music hall to the theatre and into film as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. He had a whole media empire based on his Old Mother Riley character. So Arthur Lucan, his heyday was the interwar period through the Second World War, and then into the post-Second World War period. He died in 1954, I believe, and he actually died, quite fittingly in the clothes and makeup of Old Mother Riley as he was waiting in the wings, about to go on stage. So I sort of open with that dramatic moment. And I say it was fitting because, early in his career, he did play, male characters, but then he sort of found his groove, particularly in the interwar period, playing this character, Old Mother Riley. She wasn't always called Old Mother Riley, but she came to be called Old Mother Riley. From the time he found that character, he was very committed to the Old Mother Riley character. He would even show up to the Old Mother Riley radio show in the costume of Old Mother Riley with the script memorized. And he didn't really have, as I said, once he found this character, he didn't really have a persona outside of her. For instance, he did a film with Bela Lugosi, which some of your listeners might know and some of your listeners might be surprised to know, but Bela Lugosi was touring Britain with a kind of ill-fated production of Dracula late in his career, and while he was in Britain, some producers caught wind of this and convinced him to appear in what would be the last Old Mother Riley film. By all accounts, Arthur Lucan sort of freaked out Bela Lugosi by, greeting him as Old Mother Riley and not really, Bela Lugosi didn't really get to meet Arthur Lucan. He only met Old Mother Riley. Going back a little bit, Arthur Lucan performed with his with his wife, Kitty McShane. And Kitty McShane played Old Mother Riley's daughter in the act. And that was probably the least weird thing about their relationship. They had a very tempestuous relationship. Kitty McShane sort of saw Arthur as her meal ticket. And there were times where he would try to go solo and she would prevent that, sometimes by force. Even after their professional partnership had ended by the time of Arthur Lucan's last film, she was still controlling the purse, so she would sort of appear and give Arthur his pittance for the week or the month or whatever it was, sort of embarrassing him in front of the cast and crew. And Bela Lugosi, I guess, was privy to that, but for the most part, he only met Old Mother Riley. He didn't meet Arthur Lucan. And Arthur Lucan, this whole media empire during the 1930s and particularly the 1940s, Lucan and McShane were some of the top grossing stars in Britain. They had constant touring stage productions. They had a film series. They had, as I said, a radio show, gramophone records. It really was a media empire based on this character and based on this Dame character. And what I think is kind of interesting is that, we often see the Dame as this sort of clown type figure, associated with slapstick comedy and, not being a very kind of deep character. But people like Arthur Lucan and before him, Dan Leno, really took a kind of Stanislavski-esque approach to the character. They injected pathos into the stories to give some sort of, emotional ups and downs. So the comedy was tempered with pathos. And you still see that, for instance, in Mrs. Brown's Boys. And, Old Mother Riley has a sort of backstory, which you get in bits and pieces throughout the stage and screen appearances. You do have dames that are, kind of slapstick and one-dimensional, but you also have dames, particularly from, when Dan Leno is crafting his Drury Lane dame characters in the turn of the century. You have actors that really craft a multi-dimensional dame character, and Arthur Lucan is among those entertainers.
Yeah, it's a great point, isn't it, to remember that this wasn't just about comedy and musical entertainment. They were serious performers. Yes. Who took their work very seriously. And as you say, Arthur Lucan was obviously immensely successful. I believe the films were some of the biggest grossing films of the years when they were released at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And, Arthur Lucan, or the Old Mother Riley character, was mostly associated with working class audiences in the provinces and industrial areas. For instance, it wasn't until I think it was the 10th film in the series. I believe it was Old Mother Riley's new venture. I might be wrong on that, but it wasn't until around the 10th film in the series that they got a West End release for an Old Mother Riley film. And it's sort of strange to think about today when, a film is released and it's in Odeon cinemas or, cinema chains everywhere for the most part, unless it's kind of an indie film. But, we have to remember that back in the interwar period and Second World War period and post-Second World War period, popular culture was more siloed. So you could have people who would be hugely popular with, for instance, the working classes and people in industrial areas in the provinces, but people in the West End would have, possibly not heard of them or not engaged with them. So Arthur Lucan was associated with these with the working classes, and as I said, the provinces, industrial areas, and his work really spoke to their concerns. And again, going to this issue of, his dame wasn't just a one-dimensional character. There was quite a lot going on there. You have films like, for instance, Old Mother Riley MP, where Old Mother Riley is running against not only her former boss, but he's also a landlord. So he's doubly an enemy of the working class. So she's running against her former boss and landlord to represent the local constituency as an MP, and she's running on a platform of universal employment, for instance. So there are some serious matters, and there is some content which seriously speaks to working class concerns in the Old Mother Riley stage and screen and radio and gramophone appearances.
Yeah, that's some serious social commentary there. And
yeah.
I did see that there are at least part, or I think in some cases, the entire films on YouTube these days, if anyone's interested in having a look at how they sounded and what they looked like from the time.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, actually, because there should be more on YouTube of Arthur Lucan / Old Mother Riley. Most people, if not everyone involved with these films, is dead by now, and so I feel like maybe this is too heavy an anti-capitalist message, at least as it pertains to Old Mother Riley. But I feel like it's unfair that the current rights holders are holding back people from watching Old Mother Riley's screen and radio appearances. I had to go to the BFI archives to watch a lot of these films. So there you can get them on DVD as well. But I don't think there's a set out that really has all the Old Mother Riley films, and that's a shame. And if there's any political message to be taken from this interview, it's that, we should free Old Mother Riley. Because it's unfortunate. Obviously, particularly from the 30s through the 1950s, Arthur Lucan's kind of heyday, he was quite famous, and then he kind of became famous with the generation afterwards, because his films were shown at children's matinees in cinemas from the 1950s through about the 70s. They were kind of a mainstay of children's matinees, but people who were born after that, haven't really engaged with Old Mother Riley as much, and I think that's a shame.
You mentioned that he died in the wings, waiting to go on, actually dressed. So he remained relatively popular up to his final demise.
He had a little bit of a sad ending, not just because he died suddenly, but he had some tax issues. I even found an article that said, from the 1970s, that said Arthur Lucan's ghost haunts the tax office because as retaliation for HM revenue going after him. So I think there's at least a one-act play there now. And somebody actually did write there was also a play written about it was kind of a fictionalized account of Arthur Lucan and Bela Lugosi's relationship. I think that came out about 10 years ago. So that's interesting. So people are re-engaging with Arthur Lucan. So he had lots of tax issues by the end. He had a very complex and tempestuous relationship with Kitty McShane, of course, and that continued to bother him. And you can see there was a TV movie made in the 80s with Maureen Lipman as Kitty McShane called On Your Way, Riley. So you can see, I think that's on YouTube, actually. So if you want to watch an account of the Lucan and McShane relationship, you can watch that as well. Yeah, so he was he was sort of on the decline by the time he died. But I mean, variety theater was on the decline during that time, so it might not have been completely his fault. This was when, variety theater was hurting, and theaters started to recruit, the crooners to bring in the youth market, etc. So it's hard to tell whether, it was just because people thought Old Mother Riley was old hat, or people just thought that sort of music hall and variety type light entertainment had its day. But yeah, he was still popular. And as I said, he had a kind of career revival, posthumous revival with these children's matinees. So he has this kind of posthumous reputation as a children's entertainer, partially because of his popularity at children's cinema matinees. Right. And in some ways that's true, but basically it's because, to be a popular performer in the 1930s through the 1950s, you had to appeal to, people of all ages. So he was a children's entertainer in some sense, but he was a lot more than that. And as I said, very thoughtful and talented entertainer in his own right. He really injected lots of complexity into what's kind of superficially a slapstick dame role.
That era of popularity crosses over with another type of drag that you talk about quite extensively in the book, which is the revue show that really came out of the World War II concert party concept. And it's interesting. I think we have this image of Britain in the 1950s as being a rather dull and monochrome sort of place, which is probably true. Yet we have drag revue going on to immense popularity, which just seems a bit counterintuitive, but nevertheless true, I think.
The whole book is about that sort of, trying to, because it's interesting. There's this stereotype on the one hand that, nothing makes British people laugh more than a guy in a dress. But then on the other hand, there's this popular idea that drag is and has always been taboo. And so I'm sort of bringing back that the former stereotype and also trying to inject it with some academic rigor. But yeah, so anyway, so these ex-service men's drag reviews, as I call them, the story sort of starts in the First World War. You have servicemen performing for fellow servicemen, and these entertainments often involve drag, all sorts of drag, not just, the stereotype of, they, tried to be sexy women because there were no women available. There was kind of more maternal drag, sexy drag. You could have, so they were performing all different types of femininity. But there is a troupe called Le Rouge et Noir. They're named after the colors of the First Army, which is where they sprang from. And Le Rouge et Noir, with the backing of the War Office and General Henry Horne, start to do these shows, these drag shows all over Britain. And they're sort of billed as, this is a First World War concert party brought to the British public. And it's kind of an informative and entertaining way for the public to learn about, what a First World War concert party was like. And so they toured all over Britain. They were hugely popular. They starred in they starred in one of the very first motion picture talkies produced in Britain. They weren't just side characters. They were the stars, this ex-servicemen's drag troupe. And like Arthur Lucan, they made several films. So this troupe, Le Rouge et Noir, were very, very popular. And not only did people like them because they were ex-servicemen, but people liked them because, as the reviews I quote in the book show, people thought these guys were sexy, basically. Reviews did mention, admiration for the troops' wartime service, but they also gushed over, in really kind of extreme terms, gushed over how beautiful they thought these performers were. So then, flash forward to the post-Second World War period. This becomes the ex-servicemen's drag review phenomenon pops up again, and it's even bigger than in the interwar period. You have several shows with names like Soldiers in Skirts, We Were in the Forces, Forces Showboat. You have shows like this. So this is like a popular culture phenomenon. Some of these shows, for instance, Soldiers in Skirts, is running for nearly a decade. And some of these shows, they had multiple touring companies at once to keep up with the demand. So they're huge. And like in the interwar period, critics admire these performers for their wartime service. But the main draw of the shows is the glamorous drag that's on show. The main draw is being drawn in by these performers, and if you were what we would call a straight man today, being drawn in by the allure of these performers until they remove their wigs at the end. These shows are hugely popular. They're touring all over Britain. There's many of them going on all at once. Some of the most popular ex-servicemen's drag reviews, as I said, are running for nearly a decade. So it's a genuine pop culture phenomenon, the ex-servicemen's drag review subgenre.
And all of this time that those are being performed, of course, they're battling with theatre censorship in the UK still at that point. So ever since Elizabethan times, we've had censorship in the UK up to 1968 when it was finally abolished. And I guess, and you deal with it quite extensively in the book, is this question of the perception of drag being associated with some sort of degenerate behaviour and with homosexuality particularly, which of course it was not the case, we would say now, I think. I think you open the book with, more or less with the story of one of the theatre censors who is at a review, and the way the employees of the Lord Chamberlain's office kind of had to sit there in the dark making their notes about whether the scripts that had been approved were being adhered to, and whether any of that how that was being interpreted by the audience at the time. They actually seem quite removed from the way they receive performances, and they are sometimes surprised by the way the audiences react to performances.
Yeah, that's right. I opened with an anecdote about an employee of the Lord Chamberlain's office at a drag show. The drag show is called We Are No Ladies, and it was staged in 1958. But the chapter that focuses on the Lord Chamberlain is sort of, telling the story of the Lord Chamberlain's demise, as it were, through case studies involving drag. And that sort of connects to my wider argument that if I can make such a bold statement, you can tell the story of British popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries through a story of drag. And the fortunes of drag are tied to popular culture more widely, trends in theater and entertainment more widely. I often find that people talk about drag as though it's its own kind of distinct entity that's like impervious to wider trends in the arts and in theater. And so I'm trying to sort of say, no, drag was actually at the forefront of a lot of trends in entertainment. As I was saying, when film emerged, drag was right there on film. When radio first emerged, drag was on radio, even though we think of it as a quite visual medium. When music hall was growing, drag was in the music hall, etc. So the last full chapter, or at least before the conclusion, I'm kind of trying to tell the story of the demise of the state regime of theater censorship through drag, and talking about how drag reveals the kind of fissures that were going on that led to the Lord Chamberlain's office having the power of theater censorship taken away from it. I think, the attitude towards drag by the Lord Chamberlain's office that I discussed is, might be surprising to some people, especially because you think of the theater censor and, you would be forgiven for thinking that the theater censor would be the biggest prude in the country, right? But what I found was the Lord Chamberlain's office was, had an ambivalent attitude, leaning towards tolerance with regard to drag. I say in that opening anecdote, the employee at the Lord Chamberlain's office, he basically says he thinks that the performers are effeminate homosexual men, and that the performance itself is totally lowbrow, and he doesn't like the jokes, and also the performers were going off script. But ultimately, we should express tolerance for this show. Drag or female impersonation, as the employee says, has a long tradition in Britain, and, they shouldn't get into the business of banning female impersonation from the stage. And this is despite people writing in saying that the show is quote unquote homosexual filth. I think one person says it's a massive homosexual orgy in which the converted audience joins, which is, I think, probably an overstatement. I talk about the Lord Chamberlain also not because I think the Lord Chamberlain's office's views are representative of people throughout Britain, because they aren't. A lot of these employees were, retired, middle-class military, former military officers. Mm-hmm. But they did have probably the most power over drag performance of any institution in the country. So I think they are important to talk about. And then you also have, through looking at the Lord Chamberlain, you also can get the views of, for instance, the police, who the Lord Chamberlain's office sometimes sends to look in on performances. You get the points of view of people who write into the Lord Chamberlain's office complaining about certain plays. You have the points of view of the Department for Public Prosecutions, which the Lord Chamberlain's office is dependent on to prosecute productions that are going against theater censorship law. So you do get lots of views besides the Lord Chamberlain's office. And, I think that sort of reveals in part why the state theater censorship system fell apart, because the Lord Chamberlain was reliant on all these other institutions who wouldn't always follow along with the demands of the censor. And the censor's rules were often vague. The law just said that the Lord Chamberlain's office had the power to license plays that were intended to be performed by the public. The legislation didn't say homosexuality isn't allowed, nudity isn't allowed, etc. The Lord Chamberlain's office was crafting its own rules, and often these rules were vague and not applied consistently, and that often annoyed the police and the courts. In turn, the Lord Chamberlain's office would get annoyed because they weren't the courts and the police weren't doing what the Lord Chamberlain's office wanted. So I think I talk about how there's a bunch of different reasons why the state theater censorship system declined. But that's one of them. That kind of it required quite a lot of coordination, and that coordination fell apart. And you also see how through this, you see how there wasn't kind of a consistent, ubiquitous view on what drag meant. So the police might find a show not as lewd as the Lord Chamberlain's office found it, etc.
Yes, I thought that whole section of the book really brought home to me how there was really very little enthusiasm for theatre censorship by the time it was falling apart, and through those examples of the drag shows, I thought you really illustrated how that falling apart happened, as you've just described there, really. And it's just, I don't know, you think back to it now, it's obviously a long time ago. The idea that a whole script was approved and then couldn't be deviated from in any way, in theory at least, is just unthinkable these days. And how could you possibly function like that on any scale?
Well, that was, another reason why it fell apart. First of all, the Lord Chamberlain's office is part of the royal household, so you have people thinking, "What the hell are these guys doing?" A lot of them, weren't. It's not true that none of them had theater experience. Some of them did have theater experience, and also the office sometimes relied on an advisory board of people in the theater industry. But, for instance, Lord Cobbold, if I recall correctly, I think he was the last Lord Chamberlain to oversee the system of theater censorship. And he had come from being the governor of the Bank of England. So there was an article in The Stage, for instance, from the late 1960s saying, imagine if I, after, decades as a theater critic, was hired by the Bank of England to oversee the country's finances. So you have people thinking it's kind of ridiculous that these guys are the ones in charge of theater censorship. It's ridiculous that you can read the script for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof by buying it, and you can see the film of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. You can go to New York and see Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but you can't see Cat on a Hot Tin Roof on the British stage, at least not in a public theater. Sometimes they would get away with having private theater clubs where you would pay a membership fee instead of a ticket price, and then you could maybe see Cat on a Hot Tin Roof that way. But there were just so many the system was just very eccentric, and you had a coalition of people on the left and kind of more libertarian minded people on the right who thought that this system was untenable. And by the end, even the Lord Chamberlain himself was saying this is untenable. And so there was very little protest when the Lord Chamberlain finally lost his power to censor theater. Of course, they would say that they're not censoring anything. They would say that they approve or don't approve of scripts, and then if they don't approve of a script, then the producer or the playwright or whoever censors themselves and then sends it back. So the Lord Chamberlain's office might say, we're not the censor. Other people are doing the censoring. We're just licensing scripts or not licensing scripts.
Well, that really is a very fine distinction, and perhaps one that most of us would disagree with. My thanks to Jacob for his time and sharing some of the details of his research with us. Drag, A British History is out now and available wherever you get your books from, published by the University of California Press in their Berkeley British Studies series. I've put a link in the show notes to the online sites where it's available, but do think about your local independent bookshop too. Next time, it's back to the Elizabethan stage, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X, formerly known as Twitter, at thoetp.